In the mid-17th century, the Scottish witch hunts were well underway. On Tuesday, 5th April 1659, the Presbytery of Dumfries appointed Hugh Henryson, William Magore, George Campbell, John Brown, Joseph Welsh, George Johnson, William Hay, and Gabriel Semple to go and speak to 9 accused witches at their own convenience. They were also told they were expected to be present when the 9 were executed when burned at the stake for witchcraft. In the High Court of Justiciary records in Edinburgh, the case against the witches had been opened on Saturday, 2nd April 1659, by the Commissioners in Criminal Cases to the people in Scotland, Judge Moseley and Judge Lawrence. At that time, 10 women had been charged with various acts of witchcraft, and they were all brought before the judges for trial. The proceedings in the case lasted until 5th April. One of the accused, Helen Tate, had a narrow escape, as the jury found there wasn't enough evidence against her, and her case was clearly not proven. Before being dismissed from the court, however, she was required to put up a security of £50 for her good behaviour, and that she would also pledge never to go back to the parish. Basically, she was banished from returning. The other 9 accused were Agnes Comins or Cairns, Janet McGowan, Jean Thompson, Margaret Clark, Janet McKendrig, of whom nothing is known, not even the charges laid against her, Agnes Clark, Jane Corsane, Helen Moorhead, and Janet Callan. Agnes Comins or Cairns confessed to having been a witch since she was a child. She was interrogated by Thomas Wiley and John Quart. She confessed to being away with the fairy and had a meeting with the fairy folk. They had a fire and danced, and she said they spoke in elvish voices. She said the devil had visited her in prison and told her he could strangle her, but no one else could see him as he dropped something in her eyes. She also confessed that she met at John Wilson's house and hosted witches at another place at Dundrennan. Janet McGowan was a widow. Her husband had been Andrew McGruffick, and they'd had their belongings confiscated for some reason. Then he died. She was described as a piker and thief, although she asked to borrow meal, but was refused, so she ended up cursing and doing an enchantment. She also had issues with her neighbours. It's thought she came from Kirkcudbright, as the Provost of Kirkcudbright testified against her. She'd been seen with a black boy, but he was never identified as the devil, accused by a man of placing a charm under his milking cow, and a man who confiscated her belongings found a black toad in his bed and died. In one case, a man's son, who was supposed to marry her daughter, married another, and his new wife died shortly after their marriage. Jean Thompson was another native of Kirkcudbright. A married woman, she was reasonably well off and kept sheep. She'd been confronted by a woman called Janet Miller, who denounced her as a witch. Again, the Provost of Kirkcudbright testified against her. She'd previously been in some hot water with the local kirk. Margaret Clark was also thought to come from Kirkcudbright, with the Provost of Kirkcudbright testifying against her too. She was a healer. She put a bannock on the wall to protect cows, curing them with a prayer. She was known to have had an argument over wages for a right. She was also accused of her beasts eating a man's seed stock, so he kept her away from the brewing water well. It then filled with toads. A Bailey was injured after crossing her. Agnes Clark owned a barn, kale yard and horses, so was also deemed to be reasonably well off. She was accused of causing illness, death, laying on, and quarrelling over kale, a stolen faggot, social insults, and purchases of wool and meat. She was also accused of cursing God's malediction on her knees. To appease her, milk and bread were offered by her neighbours, who saw this as a way to appease her and stop her from feeling any malice towards them. It was also hoped she wouldn't use magic to harm them. Janet Corson was a married woman and had a croft on which she grew wheat and had pigs. She'd been interrogated by William Greenson and John Carson, local justices of the peace, on 19th May 1658. She'd had disputes with neighbours, had tried healing but had failed to do so, and cursed. She was a healer, and when she failed to heal Jonet Miller, a quarrel between the two ensued, and she cursed Miller. There had also been quarrels about refusing someone borrowing something, a dispute about a borrowed cradle, and an inheritance dispute. Helen Moorhead, a widow, had a 26-year-old son and had been accused of killing a man in 1629. It seems that she had several disputes with neighbours, and another which was with her brother-in-law after her husband died. She wanted life rent of her home. There was also a dispute with him over inheritance. Her sister died in childbirth, then her brother-in-law died, then she was accused of killing her firstborn in favour of her next son, as well as cursing and quarrelling. She was also accused of taking a woman's milk and flighting, that is, hurling insults at each other during a quarrel. She was also accused of harming a man who was supposed to marry her sister, whom he'd got pregnant, but married someone else. It was her own brother who told the authorities she was a witch. Janet or Janet Callan was accused by Janet Miller of causing someone else's illness. Miller told the ill woman to get 3 stoppings of straw from Janet's house and burn them to cure her. She was also accused of putting someone into a trance, placing a curse on those who kicked her out of her house, and causing a woman to get hurt who intended to marry the man Janet was in love with. She was said to cause illness, not only in people, but animals too. Like others, however, she was in dispute with her neighbours and was quarrelsome. In a cruel twist of fate, she had taught her neighbours how to protect themselves against witches. All 9 women were found guilty of instances of witchcraft, so were sentenced to be taken on Wednesday come 8 days to the ordinary place of execution for the borough of Dumfries, White Sands. At between 2 and 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Wednesday 13th April, they were to be tied to stakes, then strangled until they were dead, then their bodies burnt to ashes. They were then to have all their movable goods forfeited, and taken from them. Helen Moorhead's movables were to be handled by the Sheriff of Nithsdale himself and plundered for the king's use. The stakes were prepared at White Sands, placed in the ground and surrounded by peat, straw, and anything else that could be burned. Ropes were brought and readied for the necks of the unfortunate women, and all were executed with fear etched on their faces. Ministers looked on, as did locals who came to watch the gruesome spectacle. On 8th March 2022, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, apologised to all men and women accused of witchcraft, calling it a historic injustice on a colossal scale. The 1563 Witchcraft Act lasted until 1736, resulting in the deaths of thousands of ordinary people. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.